Engage. We are recording.
So, yesterday we spoke about the idea of kosel achad l'shneim. There's one wall for the both of them, which means that both Za and Nukva, they share a wall. Meaning what? It's the symbolism of this is Adam and Chava being connected back to back. The idea, i.e., they share a wall. They're back, and the notion of sharing the same wall, we gave a mashal for it of a teacher who has to come down to the level of a student, and we made a few different mashals, whether he brings it down into letters of writing letters as opposed to the way it is in his mind, or bring down the idea into an analogy so that the student understands. And we said as soon as he brings it down to that level, where it's in letters, where it's an analogy, the student and the teacher are understanding the matter in the same way. And you no longer see the distinction between the great, incomparable greatness of the teacher and the lowliness of the student. It's hiding because of the great contraction that the achorayim, the achor, the back of the teacher is all that he's putting forward. And that means that he's found that aspect of him which is Yom Tov, that aspect of him which is equal to the student, enabling the student to understand him. But this is actually, in one way it's good, he's teaching the student, but in the other way, it's now not apparent anymore in any way, it's not nikar, what is the difference between the teacher and the student. So this is called one wall for the two of them. Yeah? I spoke about this yesterday. Alright, so hopefully wrapping up the 9th mimer today, starting on page Ayin Beis. Kohl's at the bottom paragraph. All of this was before the Nasira. What's the Nasira? The removal of Chava from Adam. Or what we're going to call the Tzimtzum. Right? The removal, the separation, the Havdalah between Gevura and Chesed. So all of this, that they have this one wall and they're indistinguishable from each other, is before the Nasira. But after the separation, they do no longer share the same wall. But in Yinhu, and the idea behind that is the Isbazor Achrei Daf Ayin Zayin Amid Beis, the Asa Chesed Uperish Gizayin, sorry, that Chesed comes and he separates his trunks or his roots, and the idea there, it's not so simple. I had to sort of have a look at this. The idea of these trunks or these roots are representing the 5 Gevuros. And the idea is that Chesed comes, the 5 Gevuros is sort of, as they were attached to the Chasadim, they become, Chesed sort of dislodges the Gevuros from himself. That's the idea. He undoes his roots. Means this is the separation essentially.
How do you get 5?
5 Gevuros, there's 5 Chasadim. There are different answers to that question, but in general, it's the idea of Chesed Gevur Tiferes Netzach. Chesed Gevur Tiferes Netzach Hod. Okay? Up till Hod is considered the main body of Za. Because Hod...
So Hod's not included.
Hod is included, but Yesod is not included, because Yesod represents, in a human body, it's already like the genitalia, the idea of going out of yourself, basically the ability to give, to make an other, to have children and so forth. So it's separate from the goof.
Yeah.
So the main aspects of the spheros are from Chesed until Hod, and each one of them has a sphere of Chesed, like we discussed and we drew on the board the previous class. That what does it mean that Za is built with Chasadim and Malchus is built with Gevuros? Is that each one of the spheros, Chesed, Gevur, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, they each have 10 spheros in them. Mm-hmm. But the sphera of Chesed inside of Chesed, or Chesed inside of Gevur, or Chesed inside Tiferes, those are what's the activating source and how those spheros manifest in Za. And the Gevur inside of all those spheros are the activating force. That it's the Gevur which activates on all the spheros, which creates how the spheros appear in Malchus. So the idea is that here we're saying Chesed sort of uprooted his roots, which means he separated himself from his 5 Gevuros. That's what it says in the Zohar over there, and the Perushim that correspond with it. That's one idea of the 5 Gevuros. Another way of understanding sort of more practically what it means is the idea that Hashem works through a system of 5 contractions in order to bring everything about. For example, we see this in ourselves when we look at the power of speech. The speech happens through 5 hotzaos, they're called. They're called 5 powers of the mouth: the tongue, the lips, the teeth, the palate, and the throat. Right. So those 5 aspects of contracting the pure voice that comes out is what makes letters divided up into themselves. So again, why are we built like this? Because in general, there's 5 aspects of Gevura that act upon the Chassadim in order to limit it and bring out all finite limited things. We also find something called Mantzapach. There's 5 final letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So you see in letters themselves, the end of the letters in general represent limitation, but the end of the letters, the ultimate stop. So there's 5 special ending letters, again representing this idea that there's 5 forms of putting true limitation on something. These are the same 5 Gevuros that are found inside of the Spheros.
In Zah, there's 5?
Gevura, Tiferes, Netzach, and Hod.
Also, left hand and right hand is like a team of 5 Hasidim and 5 Gevurot.
Yeah. Say it again.
There's 5 in Zah?
I mean, in other words, there's Zah is usually 6 or 7, right? Depends. Sometimes we call Zah is the 6th Spheros. Sometimes we even call it the whole Zah is the 7th Spheros.
Okay.
But when it comes to the 5 Gevuros, we learned this lesson from Lag BaOmer. It says it's Hod Shebahod. And why is it such a big holiday? Because when you get to Hod, you've fixed and corrected all the midos that are shaykh to you. Because once you go to Yesod, it's already the expression of those midos to the other. So within Zah, there's a special grouping of 5 of the 5 that are sort of inward, and Hod and Yesod, is the one that starts out. So Hod Shebahod, which is Lag BaOmer every year. It's such a big holiday because you've essentially come to the end of fixing all the inner midos, and then the rest is sort of just easier.
Right, the hard work's over.
Okay, so going on. So Chesed uproots its roots, which is these 5 Gevuros, the idea of the separation. When there was one wall for 2 of them, as we just described. Which means that the quality of the understanding and the grasp of the receiver, the student, was equal to the understanding and the grasp of the teacher, for the reason that we explained before, because the teacher's withholding all of his true understanding, and he too is sitting inside of just reciting letters or saying an analogy. And the main purpose of the Nasira, the removal, was to separate the 2 from each other. And what does that do? It makes it that it's recognizable, the unbelievable difference between the Makabel and the Mashpia, the receiver and the giver. Because once you disassociate, and the Chasadim uproots its Gevuras, which means the teacher ceases to climb down into an analogy where he's containing himself inside of this tiny metaphor. That's called undoing his Gevuros. So then all of a sudden he's in his proper state and the receiver in their proper state. They're totally different from each other, infinitely so. The receiver remains below in his relatively very low state. And the Rav remains in his high state, which is obviously much higher than the receiver, than the student. The commercial anal b'shefa seichel kamoshu bilti levush. And what is this in our mashal? That the teacher stops understanding things as it is enclosed inside of a simple mashal. He stops talking about fire and water, as we said yesterday, and he starts understanding the idea as it is, undressed from simple material metaphors, which the student Bechla has no idea what that is. Right? He can't even look at that. Yes, Sibas Hevdel Zeakosa, but how does it happen suddenly? Under what cause does this separation of the wall take place? That's what it says in the Zohar. Comes Chesed, and he uprooted his trunk, his 5 Gevuros. In other words, the reason for it is going to be an outpouring of extra Chesed. Perish b'chinas Chesed, hu b'chinas ha'arav yizgalus yisrael. What does it mean Chesed comes? Chesed represents a shine and an extra revelation, more than the contracted measure that he was doing up until now. As it's known that Malchus of Atzilus, which enlivens all the worlds, right? In other words, when Hashem creates himself the sphere of Malchus, that's the first region where suddenly worlds come into being, for the simple reason that once Hashem calls himself a king, he gives himself that attribute of kingship, then it automatically institutes the entire kingdom in an instant. All the worlds come into being from this one attribute of Hashem, his kingdom, his kingship. So as is known that the level of Malchus of Atzilus, which enlivens therefore all the worlds, it's called Koach HaPoel Banifa. It has a certain definition, description, which is called the power of the doer in the deed. Very simply meaning that this is, as we said yesterday in the class, remember there's this role reversal. When the lights are shining beyond the level of the vessels, they nullify the vessels inside of them. It's like the stones inside of the water, what do we call it? Calcium. When it's all filled and boiling, you don't see any calcium, there's stones inside of there. And the proof is when you evaporate all the water, you're left with stones. But all the while when the water's not evaporated, you don't see the stones. That's like the idea of the vessels are nullified inside the light. And then when there's a tzimtzum, it's the other way around, that the light gets contained inside of the vessel. When the light gets contained inside of the vessel, that happens at Malchus of Atzilus. If you remember yesterday, we said there's this divide, which is Zah on one hand, which is that the vessels are nullified and the light is paramount. That's like the teacher. And then Malchus on the other hand, which is that the teacher is the student is paramount and the teacher is enclosed inside of him, coming down to bring his mashal to the student. So this idea of Malchus, the name for it is Koach HaPoel Banifa. It's called the power of the doer inside of the deed. In other words, Hashem is contracting himself, he's bringing his light, and he's crawling inside of the deed. Right? Instead of the doer being demonstratively over the deed and nullifying it, he squeezes inside of the deed and he's hiding inside of the creation, as it were. So everything that's in existence is that we see. It's Hashem's power of the doer, but wrapped up inside of the deed itself. So this is called Malchus. V'chayus koach zeh ba v'nimshach l'kol makabli. And the life force of this power, it comes to every single recipient, which is all of us and everything you ever heard of or saw. Everything is a recipient. Everything in creation is a recipient of this light. And each one has Hashem's power inside of him, sort of hiding in there and creating him. Each one according to their limitation. The sun, much bigger entity, has more of Hashem's power in the doer in that deed. A little fly, you know what I'm saying? So each one is measured out exactly as much of the doer that can fit inside of that deed. And if he would receive a little bit even extra, more than that little miniature vessel that he has set aside for him, he would right away disappear. It would become like the calcium back in the water. It just wouldn't be anymore. So all the time that creation is in place, it's because Hashem is delicately, and that's mamisha. I can't say that word enough, because even a drop, hairs more in any single one of the created beings, they would cease to be in their present form. It's like amazing. That's why I say the power of Gevurah is even more wondrous than the power of Chesed. How Hashem is measuring and fitting into each and every single thing exactly what it can handle, and not a drop more. So if it would have more than it should, it would become batul b'metzias l'gamri. It would completely disappear. The vessels will be nullified from the light. Because according to the level of the nif'al, the thing which is made, the deed, so too is the quality of the doer, the godly life force which is inside of it. If the power of the doer would shine more than the deed can handle, it just simply would cease to be. As it says, if Hashem would stick even his little finger into the angelic realms, they would all just nullify themselves out of existence. That means even his little finger means even the smallest aspect of more of the doer inside the deed would disappear. So it comes out, very clear terms, that the influence of Malchus into Bia is Bria, Yitzira, and Asiya, the lower three worlds, the influence of Malchus into the lower three worlds is all happening at a level of Midah of a Gevul, measure and limitation. That's what defines it. That's what Malchus is. As we said a moment ago, Malchus is where the role reversal happens. When the light hides inside of the vessel instead of the vessel hiding inside of the light. So all things that happen in the worlds of Bia are created with this power of Malchus, which already the power of Malchus is the power of the doer inside of the deed. In other words, not only the things that Malchus creates, but the second Hashem calls himself Melech, he is a king inside of that sphere of kingship. It already has measured out the entire kingdom. Right? And that's where, therefore, all the worlds sort of automatically come from there and only there. They don't come from the higher spheres, because that would not create worlds, create only godliness. So therefore we could say that, as I kind of just mentioned, that it's understood from this that Malchus, even when it's in when it's in Atzilus proper, it's receiving from Zah also in a way of measurement and limitation. Whereas not only, because everything Malchus does is based on this notion of measuring the light. Certainly all the output from Malchus is based on measuring the light, but also the input into Malchus is based on measuring the light. And that's what we were saying before, that Malchus is built, she herself is built with the Gevuras. Right? You understand what I'm saying there? That not only is what comes out of it the idea of measured light, but even what she receives from Zah is already measured light from Zah.
Well, even Zah's measured light also.
Not in this capacity though. We're saying Zah is built with the Chassadim, and the Chassadim, their Indian is not to measure themselves, but to rather to expand infinitely. And that's why we say that Zah is the Sof Olamos HaEin Sof. It's not, it has more in common with the Orient Sof than it has with Bria. Whereas Malchus has more in common with Bria than it has in the Orient Sof.
It doesn't have measured light over there, there just has...
They say that the measurement that it has, the only measurement that it has, and this is kind of a very deep meditation in its own right, is not that the spheres themselves are measured, but the measurement is that they are not able to extend themselves into the lower worlds. In other words, they have one limitation, and that is they shine infinitely with nothing holding them back. The one limitation they have is that they can't shine into the lower worlds. So that's in a certain sense a measurement. But it's not that each thing there is measured. It's that they have one limitation, is that their infinite light cannot come down into the lower world.
So
it's like blocked into the world of Atzilus itself. Say it again?
So you can't recognize any vessels up there. It's one big scaleless.
Look,
Zav Atzilus.
Look, it's still it's the lowest aspect. It's the Sof Olamos of the Ein Sof, which means that in Ein Sof type spheros, it's the most delineated.
Right.
Okay, so I don't want to say there's no spheros, because there are places where there's much less aspect of sphero. But there we do say there's something called light inside a vessel. We do say that, which is kind of what the point you're making. But it's still, what's the limitation? We still say Ein Sof Lispashtusa. There's still no limit to their expansion. They just can't go into Biyah. So there's something holding them back. But it's not that Chesed is essentially now definable, because really it goes on forever. And Gevur also goes for all this. It's a little bit of a gray area there. It's like a medium point. Okay. But ultimately, certainly, what we're saying here is that it represents the infinite, and only in Malchus do you get to the finite.
Could you just remind me how does that light get into Malchus? If it's limited, if the only limitation is that it can't go into Malchus.
It can't go into the lower worlds. It does go into Malchus.
Oh, so it's not limited to.
And it even does go into the lower worlds, but it goes into the lower worlds in a vastly different form than it is in itself. In other words, all the lights in the lower worlds ultimately is light that's siphoned off from Atzilus. What do I mean it can't go into the lower worlds? Is that in its Atzilus-like manner, it can't be found in the lower worlds. Because it goes through the filter of Malchus, which is the whole point we're trying to make, which makes it that anything that comes out of Malchus is automatically limited. So even the light that it gives to Malchus, it's like, remember, it's the Achor of Zah, right? Which means that even in Zah, which is this like infinite light, it has inside of it a potential for limitation, and that's what it gives over to Malchus. And that's the idea of the mushal, of the Rav contracting himself into a mushal or into letters. It's not a real contraction on the side of the Rav, because he is the idea in its fullness, but he gives over that to the student. So even what Malchus receives is limited. Certainly what it gives is limited.
Are we talking about Malchus of Atzilus?
Yeah, this whole conversation, Malchus of Atzilus. Zah and Malchus is in Atzilus.
So the Simsum in the Malchus is the Simsum.
That's what you wanted to say yesterday, and I'm still saying no. There's a the Tzimtzum is called the Tzimtzum HaRishon. And the Tzimtzum HaRishon happens far beyond this Atzilus.
higher.
Close, it's Malchut
At a
Ein
higher-
Sof of the Old
When you
Sof.
say far beyond, you're talking about higher.
talking about
Yes,
it.
yes. But again, as I said to you yesterday, it depends. Atzilus is a relative term.
Yeah.
So even when you go up way higher into the Orient Sof, sometimes we also call that Atzilus as well.
Yeah.
And then you could say, yes, this is the great Tzimtzum, because between Atzilus and Bria above, that's the great Tzimtzum, Tzimtzum HaRishon. But down here already, we're in the lower Atzilus, the great Tzimtzum has already taken place. Okay, so what are we saying? That even the input into Malchus is already from a limitation. You know, to come, you have a seat waiting for you. You can do it. And why is that? Because it's the source of all receivers. So, meaning it itself is a receiver. So anything that's going to come into a receiver, it already has to be. If you're a receiver, that means the one who's giving to you has to take your needs into account, or you're not going to receive anything, right? So since it's the source of all receivers, and there's everything that comes after it is a receiver from it, but it too is a receiver, then obviously the light that goes into it is also measured to fit its needs.
But it's not the first receiver.
It is. I mean, in a sense that it's actual yesh to a certain degree. In other words, you could say that the makum panoi, the halal, the empty space that seems to itself is like the first receiver. We always emphasize over there, it's not yet a kli. It's just the root, the source of what will be later a kli. This is actually the first kli. Real kalim started in Malchus of Atzilus. That's a klal. In general, light inside a vessel, the notion that the role reversal happens and you have light in vessel, that's in general in Atzilus. But in particular, it's in Malchus of Atzilus. And that's what Mendel and I were sort of just arguing about. In other words, isn't there also limitation in the rest of Atzilus? Because it's already light in vessel. And the answer to that is no, it's really only light in vessel in Malchus. Just what? Every sphera of Atzilus has a Malchus of that sphera. So there's some aspect of Kli in every one of the spheres, but Be'ikr, it's in Malchus of Atzilus, which is all the Kalim. So that's where Kalim really begin, Malchus of Atzilus. And that's what we're saying. It's the source of all receivers. And this is the exact mashal we just gave. When the teacher has to contract himself into a metaphor that the receiver can understand. That's when Za is it's called the back of Za. It's when the Za contracts itself to give over to Malchus in accordance with what the worlds can handle. Which means that the real major force of the Hashpah, Shner, come, you'll only understand if you stay in the room. I mean, even then, it's not 100% avadai, but you're much, much closer. So that means that if you're contracting, so what does it mean? That Za is basically hiding all of its influence. And this arise the situation, as you said, one wall for two of them. They're back to back. We already explained that makes the mashpia equal to the makabel. You don't see the greatness of God. Hashem is hiding himself because the teacher is climbing himself into the same mushal of fire and water. You can't tell the greatness of the teacher. You can't see the greatness of the mashpia. Now comes the separation, which is what this whole paragraph is talking about. When the mashpia wants to separate the student from him, when he wants to show himself, all he has to do is stick his little finger, like it says. Hashem sticks his finger, and boom, then you clearly see the difference between the mashpia and the makabel. When Hashem will show a little bit more light, he won't climb down into the koach hapol v'nifal, contracting himself to give existence bichlal to the receiver, so that right away would separate the receiver from the giver, would show the awesome difference between the receiver and the giver.
Wouldn't that eliminate the receiver?
It would, but that itself shows.
So how is that separation?
Because that itself shows.
It might be absorption.
Well, it shows that, in other words, what looked like, in other words, the idea of the little creature holding himself sort of toe to toe with Hashem, having this feeling that, the Tower of Babel, they wanted to climb up the tower and like make war with Hashem, because there's this feeling of arrogance and idol worship and all these things of that you have some place, and okay, God's big, but I'm also big, right? This concept that the teacher, the student have Erech. All Hashem has to do is undo a little bit of his contraction, and he reveals the incomparable nature of the relationship.
When you transfer that light,
Okay, so he shows that essentially the Gevuras are of no significance, whereas before they felt they were of significance.
And if you show non-existence, I mean, then that means it's absorption. It's a reabsorption of the separation. So it's a unification rather than a separation.
We'll get to it. I hear what you're saying. It's a good question. Yeah.
but is there a separation, or is there a separation once the information Mashal is being given to the student, or is it always connected like that?
Say it again.
Is there necessarily a separation once the information, the sechel, is being downloaded from the teacher to the student? Is there a separation in creation between the two, so that the malchut can give to the lower world, or is there always a connection?
One more time. Try that again. Sorry.
You talked about the connection and the fact that the teacher reduces itself.
Yeah.
And
That's
then,
from Za to Malchus,
yeah.
right? Okay.
And then you just talked about a separation.
Which means an extra input of Za into Malchus. That's what the separation is, when the Chesed comes up and uproots its trunks, which is basically it's giving extra Chesed to separate the Gevuras, which is this receiver, from the giver. So what would that look like in the mashal? Is that all of a sudden I'm talking about fire and water, I'm teaching my child and everything's going well, and he and I are on the same level, and then I say, and the fire is the Oring Sof, and the water is the Kalim, then I right away, once I show a little bit more light, I lost the student. In this capacity, you could say he gets absorbed, but in a normal capacity, he separates from me. We have all of a sudden you can see there's no comparison whatsoever to the student and the teacher, whereas a second ago you thought they were on the same level.
Good.
That's the idea. It separates them.
Good.
So what I want to, my question is this: in the process of creation, you were just describing,
Right.
is there an actual separation at that point between the Za and the Malchut?
Yeah, there is. We'll see about it. I'm saying the nimshal of all this. I want to let the Rebbe describe. But yes, of course there is. He's describing that this is what took place. Was that at first the Gevuras were tucked inside of the Chasadim and they were not separated. Therefore, they had shared one wall, and there was there was a sort of issue that was going on that you couldn't really see the true nature of the light, and then there was a separation. How it's all going to spell itself out, I'd rather leave it to the Rebbe, to be honest with you, because I don't want to mess it up here. Okay, so when the mashpia wants to separate the makabel from him, yashpia la makabel v'izgalus yisera yosem kafiyat sin. So then what does he do? He gives over a little bit more than the student can handle. That he's going to come out of these physical analogies that he made. And then automatically what's going to happen, as we just said, the little student's going to all of a sudden realize, like, wow, this teacher's a million miles ahead of me. I have no idea what he's talking about. Because he unleashed the idea and he undressed it from its analogy. And what is this? It's the opposite of concealment, right? At first he was holding himself back, containing himself. He let himself out. The opposite, he reveals. That's why in the Zohar it says Chesed comes and uproots the trunks. Because it's really the act of Chesed is the idea of more revelation than it was previously allotting. Because that's what Chesed means. Every concept of Chesed means revelation, which is more than is needed. Right? When you do Chesed to someone, the definition of Gemulus Chasadim, that you have to do kindness to a person, is that it's not tzedakah. Tzedakah means you have like a mitzvah to do tzedakah because the person is lacking and you have to fill his lack. It says Gemulus Chasadim, you can even do with the rich. You can give a chesed to a rich person. It doesn't mean you're filling his lack. You're just giving him the definition. You're giving more than he's needs. You're doing. That's why they call chasidim. What is a chasid? He's someone who goes lifnim mishur asadin. He does more than he has to. That's the definition of chesed. The kamo Avram shaya isha chesed, like Avram, who is an Isha Chesed Nadiv B'Yoser. He just gave much more than he had to. He's standing there for no reason. It's like a Chabad house. He's standing in the middle of nowhere, and all of a sudden there's a hurricane. Everybody's freaking out, and you're busy like feeding the hungry and so forth, clothing the cold. Who put you there to do that? It's not, you're not the government. You're not obligated to do this. Just Chesed. Here to do Chesed. Avram Avinu. He just gives good at everything he can to every person. And what does it mean? It means giving more and not just what's needed, not just the necessity. On the contrary, when you limit your chesed to that which is necessary, that comes from gevurah. That's not an attribute of chesed. That's the attribute of gevurah. That you figure out what the boundaries are, and you allot what is needed based on those boundaries. So that's like tzedakah, basically. I mean, tzedakah, it says, what is it? Dai yachsor shemachsor lo. Something like that, I apologize. But you have to give him the lack, that which is lacking to him. In other words, this is the end time of you're not commanded to make him rich. So in other words, you have to give the person what his lack is. This is the mitzvah tzedakah, which means you take into account his lack and you fill it, and period, no more. Chesed is not that. Chesed atzmo ba'ashpa v'riboid dinyan dai machsor sheyachsor lo. Sorry, just had to get that out there. So chesed is the opposite. It's giving him more than the boundaries would dictate. And he says, look elsewhere. What we will explain, we're going to go into this in a very deep way. In the Indian of Tov v'Chesed, there's a few Maimarim coming up that are going to describe the difference between Tov and Chesed pretty soon. And Zeu sha'omrim shesibas ha-nesira hu al-yedei da'asa Chesed. That's what it means in the Zohar when it says the reason of the Nesira, the removal of Chava from Adam, the separation of the receiver from the giver, was because Chesed came along. That's what it means. It means Hashem added extra light and made it very clearly obvious that the receiver was on no level with the giver. Which means that once the light of Shefa comes from Chesed of Zah, and where to get this ability to shine more Chesed, because the source of the Chesed of Zah comes from the Chesed of Erech Anpin. Not necessarily to get in all wrapped up in this, but Erech Anpin is Keser, the lower part of Keser, and there the spheros or mamish go on Arin Kates, because Keser doesn't even have the limitation of Atzilus, where it's light in vessel, as I mentioned before. Even though in Atzilus itself, the light in vessel is pretty dicey at that, but above Atzilus, the first level above Atzilus is called Keser, and the lowest level of Keser is called Erech Anpin. There it's called Rav Chesed, because there's mamish Ein Sof to the Chesed there. And when Zah will pick up a little piece of Rav Chesed, that's what enables it to have a little extra push of what it was normally doling out to Malchus, and it outdoes it and makes the Nesira the separation. So automatically the wall gets this.
What was the dot off of?
What's that? Erech Anpin. Of Erech Anpin.
About that.
Let me just finish this one line. Behuv dal Zah min Nukva. What does this do? It separates Zah from Nukva. The Nikor Gile or Bechinas Hazah. And what does that do? It makes it recognizable for the first time, the real revelation of what Zah has. That it's not the same as Malchus. That it's a completely incomparable revelation. Okay, you want to say?
So,
Mazel tov, we finished the 9th Maimer. Only 19 to go. Class is not over though. We're just starting class. Yeah.
about the Kesser. Okay, so there's a separation. I mean, there's actually Chesed in Kesser that's identifiable as Chesed.
To some degree, it's not exactly.
I thought the first that was in Atzilus. The first time there was the concept of separation.
Even far beyond Kesser, there's something like identifiable spheres. But you're right; they're all nullified, but you can still name them. In other words, there's the source of the spheros. Put it like this: if spheros come out eventually, then they're also inside. So even though you can't find them, you can still talk about them. You still discuss them. And yes, they are still there. This was the whole conversation that we had before you got here, which was essential. We'll revisit it for a second. There's a machlokes in Kabbalah itself, whether or not the idea of the distinguished, individualized lights are a product of the tzimtzum, which means they don't exist until they go through the prism,
Right.
or whether they're inside of the Or Ein Sof, but they're just not able to be seen. And the prism, all it does, or the tzimtzum, it just brings them to light. So according to what you're saying, so to speak, is that in the Or Ein Sof, all there is Or Ein Sof. There are no individuals.
Right.
And the fact that in Atzilus, suddenly you have 10 spheros, it's because the tzimtzum created spheros and vessels, and the light just sort of filled them in, like water goes into a blue cup, water goes into a red cup, into a yellow cup, but it's all the same water. But that's not how we ultimately hold. The Rebbe Rashab brings, like, it's kind of one of his, like, main life's works, it seems, because he brings it in many, many places, and he proves it, like, in an exhausting way, that there are 10 spheres of light before, inside the Or Ein Sof. And that's what this whole mimer is about also. That there's something called darkness and light. And what is darkness? Darkness is the 10 spheres of light, while it's yet inside of the Or Ein Sof. We call it darkness because compared to the infinite light, it's dark. But really, it's a finite type of light, which is not created by vessels, but rather it distributes itself into vessels when the vessels appear. So there is something called chesed of keser. Shner. There is something called chesed of keser. Come. We're not done. We're just getting warmed up.
We're going to the mikveh.
And
So,
whatever holy religious obligations you have, they can't be holier than this at this particular moment.
So who's
Since
doing
this
this,
is the
Rabbi?
Seder, not because of that particular thing. Everything's holy. This is the Seder. Where are you running?
Who's doing this?
Who's doing what?
Who's bringing down this extra chesed to do Nasira? It's part of the process of creation. It's
Im yirtza hamashpi, it says. God
is it a process of creation?
Yes.
Yeah, this, and then there
Yes.
was Nasira.
Yes.
Okay,
Hashem
and where was
decided
that?
to do it, basically.
That was in Zav Seals to Moshe Seals.
Yeah. Yeah.
So where did it become recognizable that it was? I thought, like, is this Mashiach? Is this the end goal? Is this realizing that Kalim are all? Like,
no, not necessarily.
This already happened. This was already.
This actually, what this does ultimately, in a certain sense, listen, I really, like I said, as far as the Nim Shal is concerned, ultimately I want to sort of leave it to the Rebbe, which is what you're asking against, what Shlomo was asking. I know we're like looking for there, but he's drawing this whole thing out in a big way. But in general, what this does, it actually is like a shvira almost it creates, because it makes it so that the vessels cannot handle the light. And what this does is amplifies the darkness. It makes clear distinguishing between good and bad, light and dark. Whereas before that, you didn't really have that. So this is what basically sets into motion the whole avoda. Is that you have to now you're in a world where the light and dark are separated, which is on one hand is
this
good.
is our lighter now.
On one hand, it's good, because now you can theoretically come and have a face-to-face relationship with the woman and the man. But originally, in other words, how did it happen? From a surgery, from a separation, a pulling apart. So we're talking about the pulling apart is really the whole point he's trying to make here. I think is that the pulling apart, which looks like a big tzimtzum and a gevura, what is it really? It's chesed. He's still staying with this theme of Havayahu Elokim, that the separation itself is an act of chesed. Because he's giving more light, even, and that's what makes the separation.
Well, we would be in existence without it, so that's the chesed, that we're in existence.
When the teacher comes down to the student, he's already bringing him into existence, right? When he goes down and makes one kosel, it's just that the existence is the greatness of the relationship is not recognized. But the existence of the makabel is there. Listen, as I said, I'd like to see it inside. We all have the same sort of questions, and we're looking for the same answers.
I think about a different question. The other time in the Torah that we talk about the back is Moshe asking about Hashem's essence, and Hashem says, "You can see my back, but not the rest of me, and I'll hide." Is that linked at all to this, or that's something different?
I don't know how you would relate it, but over there it's just saying that, a created being, there's some limitation as to how high you can actually see. It can be revealed to you. So if Moshe would see the essence of Hashem, he would cease to exist.
Moshe is like the Ba'ala shel Shechina. It's interesting what you're saying. Moshe Ba'ala shel Shechina, who's Ba'ala shel Shechina? Zair Anpin. ולא תראה רק את אחוריי. It's kind of what you say with the back. Can be.
Don't know.
And yet,
Don't have the answer
and
to
yet
that
later,
question.
later they say that Moshe was the only one that talked to Hashem face to face. So both of these things come up with that. I don't know.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, we'll have to see that mimer when it comes around. Okay, we're starting the 10th mimer.
Nice.
This mimer, sorry, the 9th mimer. We finished the 8th mimer. Okay, excuse me. We're starting the 9th mimer. My apologies.
You started from the beginning.
Yeah.
What?
2 years ago.
No. Okay. So let's do it. Biura inyan hu. What does it all mean? It's known that there's two types of hamshachas. What is a hamshacha? Michael. It means to draw down two things. Do what you gotta do. You're new here, son. We can't pick on you as much. It talks about drawing down two things, right? Hamshacha, there's two ways of hamshachas to draw down. One, mashanimshach basod shoresh. What's called hamshacha at the level of the root of a thing. That you draw down from something's root. Ba'beis besod tosefes. And the other one is called an add-on. In other words, additional to the root. Like we spoke about sort of in Lech Lecha, in Parshas Lech Lecha, by the Bima, Avram was told by Hashem, Lech Lecha, go to your root, go to the source of all creation. In other words, there's the idea of going to the very top of where you come from and getting drawn down from the source. But here we're talking about something drawing down from above the source, an add-on to the root itself. So there's two types of hamshachas, drawing down from within the source of all things or from even beyond the source of all things. So getting hamshacha from the root is the idea of getting a hamshacha that's measured according to the measuring stick, which is called the kav. But techilas ishtalshlus. And the very beginning of all the descent of the worlds, Hashem had already, as we said a minute ago, measured out, determined what everything, like when he said, when he made his malchus, he became melech, he already determined the entire kingdom, which means every single thing already had its exact measure of light, which was intended to go into it. And that's why the kav is called the kav hamida. It means the measuring stick within the kav, he already measured every single possible item in creation. So getting hamshacha from the shoresh is the idea of getting hamshacha from your root, from where your essential perfection of creation was supposed to come from. Reaching your perfection. How the kav measured out how each world should receive what it was due to it. Was exactly what went up in Hashem's will, in accordance with what He determined creation should look like. Which means simply, in the higher world there would be a revelation of God, and in the lower world there would be not a revelation of God. In other words, He created these worlds to have a coarser ability, so that in the lower worlds, according to what's measured out for them, they were intended to be called the lower worlds for a reason, which they weren't supposed to have Elokus revealed to them in the same measure or at all, namely this world. So it says that, as it says, that my right hand founded the earth, my left hand founded the earth, and my right hand stretched forth the heavens. Left hand is the Gevura hand, and therefore founded the earth, making them have a less measure of godliness. The right hand founded the heavens, more godliness. Not to Shamayim, Mavara Shamayim. Not to Yamino, Mavara Shamayim. He stretched out his right hand, he created heaven. Not to Smolo, Bara Aretz. Another pasuk, he stretched out his left hand, created the earth. Same idea. Shamayim and Olimos Elyonim Bechlal. Shamayim represents, the heavens represents in general the higher worlds. Shenivru b'yaminu shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They were created with the right hand of Hashem. Which means Giloy Or, more revelation. He measured out for them that they should see godliness more. And therefore, Olimos Elyonim v'nivroim v'tzva Shamayim hen ruchnim. And that's why the higher worlds and all of the creations in the hosts of the heavenly worlds are spiritual. Spiritual entities, by definition, can experience more light. Their vessel does not block out the light. They're continuously in the presence of Hashem, therefore they're continuously nullified to the will of Hashem. They don't have choice. Because it shines there, the revelation of godliness. Whereas the Olamos Tachtonim Nivru Mismol Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the lower worlds were created with Hashem's left hand. Then Bechinas Hester Behelim Or. What is the left hand? The Gevura, him holding himself back, the light. And Eino Meir Begilu, therefore it doesn't shine openly. Therefore they come into being in a way they feel themselves more than they feel God.
I don't understand what I'm saying. It's just a Asiya Gashmas?
No, even the lower worlds, I guess you could say, is Yitzira and Asiya. The higher worlds, Atzilus and Bria, in general. But certainly, Asiya Gashmi is the ultimate example of Yesh. With Pratius, who should be all about Atzilus, Meir Gile or in Sof Baruch. Oh, here, okay, he brings it into his own separate categories. If you want to break this down, what does it mean higher and lower? Atzilus is a revelation of the Or Ein Sof openly. That's called his right hand. It's all godly all the time. And what is Atzilus? As we said before, it's still called the worlds of the Ein Sof, which means that the Kav, which came from the Or Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, it shines openly as a Kav of divine light, even after the Tzimtzum, where only in Atzilus. So that's what it means the higher worlds is essentially Atzilus, because pure godliness and no Yeshus at all is present there. As we said above. Hine ha'oras ha'kav meir begilui mamish b'atzilus b'chinas mahus ha'or v'ziv hazeh, which means that the shine of the kav itself is in atzilus, the mahus ha'or. Right? As we said, what is the idea of mahus, the matzias, that at least the ray of Elokus itself is experienced in atzilus. In other words, not just that the ray cloaks itself into entities, and then you can make out that these entities are enlivened by God. Like we said before, the power of the doer in the deed. That's already in the lower worlds. So you can see the doer, but only through the deed. So you're not actually ever seeing the doer straight. You're seeing him encloaked, and that's called basically in translation, or in a mirror. You're not looking at him, you're looking at him through a reflection. Whereas in Atzilus, you can see the mahus of Elokus. There's no reflection. The ray of godliness is there. So that's the way Atzilus came about from the Or Ein Sof. The Or Ein Sof shines directly into it. In other words, it's close to it. It's not distant itself through curtains and so forth. But it shines the Or Ein Sof directly into the world of Atzilus. Now we're going to challenge that. Is Atzilus really that? Doesn't it say Chochma ma'ayin timatze? Doesn't it say that Chochma comes about from ayin, which means that, what does it mean? Chochma ma'ayin timatze means Chochma is found from ayin, which means Chochma is like a yesh, which is found from ayin. Yesh ma'ayin is the exact opposite of what we're saying. Yesh is when you feel yourself, and when the godly revelation is withheld from you. So if we say Chochma comes from ayin, sounds like Chochma is a yesh as well. Chochma Atzilus is the beginning of Atzilus. Why do we say that? Because it comes about through Tzimtzum as well. And it does not have the essential light, only a shine of light. However, right, we already said, the fact that you see the mahus of Elokus, it's true you see the mahus, but the mahus of what? You see the mahus of the ray, of one thin ray of Elokus. That's different than seeing the mahus of all the Or Ein Sof. Because the idea of taking one ray out does not only minimize the quantity, but it minimizes the quality as well. Once you have a ray of godliness, you have a limited nature of godliness. Now, even the limited nature that you're seeing, you can see it, mamish, which you can't see in the lower worlds, only through a garment or a mirror. In Atzilus, you can mamish see the ray, but it's only a ray. So this that we say that Atzilus also is something that comes from nothing and it's like a yesh, it's because the godliness that it sees is also not the essence of godliness. But whatever godliness that it sees, it's seeing it mamish. And that's the idea of Atzilus. It only shines a ray of the Kav. Mind you, here he's saying a ray of the Kav. So that's even more contraction than what I was saying. Because the Kav itself is only a ray. And even a ray of the Kav is already a ray of a ray. That's where you can see the mahus of in Atzilus. But nevertheless, we're still giving Atzilus its proper due, because that ray you can see. You can actually see the Gilui of Elokus Mamish, not only in translation. Because the lights of Atzilus are not a different mahus from the infinite light of God Himself. And what is this like? Analogy is the idea of the sunlight coming through the window. Right? Now, the sun itself has infinite rays. And when it comes off, there's only a certain amount of rays that are going to even come to like sort of this hemisphere. But even when they come to this hemisphere, there are only a few of them are going to come through the window. But nonetheless, what comes through the window is mamash the rays of the sun. As opposed to if I draped a curtain in front of the window, even what came through is no longer the rays of the sun. It's called a tolda, or shel tolda. It's like a offspring of a sun ray, and that's what goes into Bria and Sir Nasiya. But when you can see directly through the window, you can see mamish the mahus of light. We'll hold here though.
Ya Hashem Kroy.
What's your rush?